Dr. Halpern-Felsher, thank you so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me. Hello.
My pleasure. Well, I know that I had been interested in talking with you for a while. You direct the REACH Lab, and you've done such fantastic work in terms of creating content and tools and resources for folks who care about youth prevention. And so I'm glad we finally got an opportunity to chat and to connect. Just to get us kicked off here, I'm wondering your perspective on what brought you to this area of youth substance use prevention and why you think it's so important.
I'm an adolescent developmental psychologist, and I've been looking for 25, 30 years about how adolescents make decisions about, as I often joke, sex, drugs, rock and roll. And when we think about that, there are a lot of health related, potentially risk behaviors that we hope people grow into. So, having a healthy sexual relationship at a point when one is ready, or even a healthy relationship with some substance like alcohol, a glass of wine. But when you're talking about a lot of the substances that we're talking about here, there is not a healthy relationship, particularly as an adolescent. So when you're talking about tobacco or nicotine, cannabis, even alcohol as a young person, some of the other illicit drugs, we are really worried about the addiction, brain development, and so on. So that's a lot of why I started thinking about these areas even more deeply, is just the concern about adolescent development, adolescent health. I want young people to grow up and have healthy lives and healthy adulthoods and not start young with drugs that could really change that trajectory for young people.
Absolutely. Well, and I know I share that concern as well. You know, that it seems like this is something where it seems like very consistently when you look at the data, and regardless of substance, really, the earlier that a young person starts putting this into their brain, the greater the ripple effect that it has on their development throughout the life course. And it's something also that is actually preventable. And I'm curious
Yes.
from the data that you've collected, one of the hardest one of the hardest connections to draw, I think, in terms of getting, say, funding for prevention, is being able to draw that straight line between what we're doing and the outcomes that we see, because it's tough to say, like, well, this is the reason why. You've done some studies though that show that there's certain prevention initiatives that you can take that actually have a real difference in youth behavior, right?
Absolutely. Our research, first of all, it's really important that we meet teens where they're at. That's the most important. So, when you, for example, when you walk into a classroom as an educator or health professional or into your clinics or anywhere, you have to realize that you're going to have teens anywhere on that curriculum, from no use at all the way to using on a regular basis, dabbling on a Saturday and a party, all the way to dependency and substance use disorder. So one of the most important things that we've learned from our research, my research on adolescent decision making, and in developing our prevention and intervention curriculums, is you cannot walk in and just say no and no. We had that in the 80s, and I think we've gotten away from that. Not just saying to teens, don't use, period, because you're going to have teens who have used or who are thinking about using or whose friends have used. And you go in and you say, don't use, they shut you down. They don't want to listen to you anymore. And if you go in and you say use is really bad, and you only talk about the risks and you only talk about scare tactics, you also lose teens, because teens will say, you're talking about lung cancer and you're talking about how bad it is, but wow, I really enjoyed the using the drug, or my friend used it and they had a good experience. So I'm not saying that we go in and say use is good. Of course not. But we have to address the perceived and real benefits and the perceived and real risks in an honest scientific way when we talk to teens. So that continuum of risk, that understanding of how they weigh the risks and benefits, which is different from adults. We may not care about, our social aspect on a Saturday night as much as a teen does. So we have to understand where they're coming from. We also do have to help them weigh those risks
Mm.
and benefits and demystify some of the perceptions that they have. So that's probably the number one tenet that I would say. Then we have to understand the drivers, stress, flavors. They like the buzz. They're not worried about lung cancer. That's not on the horizon for a long time. So really coming from the youth perspective is really important.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think so. What strikes me, and I think about this a lot. I was actually at a high school on Wednesday morning, a couple days ago, and there's always this diverse range in the audience where you've got some folks who might never be using substances anyway. You've got others who are and really don't want to listen to you, and then there's the folks in the middle, right? Who could go either way, or maybe even are on the bubble or have tried some. And those are the places where I know from like the health care provider perspective, the empowerment through information is the most important part because certainly like we could say with a lot of evidence behind us, like hey, your neurological trajectory, psychological trajectory probably looks better without exposure to this. But ultimately, they all have to make their own decisions. Like whenever they will come in contact with vapes, they will come in contact with THC, alcohol. What they choose to do with it will be based on their judgments. And we're not going to be there. Their parents aren't going to be there. It's got to be in the moment. And that's where I think information and education, and like you're saying, not just necessarily like danger, 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 but give the full picture. But that also does include where it might impact their development. That empowers them to make those active choices.
I 100% agree. And on that, two thoughts on that. I mean, one, when I started building our curriculums, I actually didn't think teens wanted to learn about the brain. It was funny, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, we started developing our curriculums. Some of our advisors and my partners were saying, oh, no, we need to talk about the brain. And I thought, teens don't want to listen to about brain science. They love learning about the brain. They love understanding it, but we have to teach it in the right way. We cannot say to teens, you're stupid and your brains are developing until you're 25, and until then we don't trust you. That is not the right message, and it's not true either. I mean, teens are wonderful. I'm one of the biggest teen advocates out there. There's so much good about teens and what teens are developing, and their ability to learn language and be creative and be social activists and social justice concerns and environment. So we need to channel that into helping them understand their brains. So we teach it and talk about it from, it's cool that your brains are developing. It's why you can do things I can't do anymore. It's, the can't teach an old dog new tricks kind of idea. They're still in the new tricks phase. But then we talk about, but it's important to realize that the same time that this is cool and great, you're more likely to become addicted. We're more likely to rewire our brains, change our brain chemistry if we add drugs into it. That's how we talk about it. The other thing that you mentioned is that teens sometimes are going to be using, and sometimes there's not much we could do about it. So in addition to teaching them how to resist, and we talk about refusal skills, we also need to help them stay safe if and when they do encounter drugs. So whether it's them or their friends, if they're at a party, so teaching them things like don't drink and drive, don't use anything and drive, having Narcan in the case of fentanyl and other opioid overdoses, being aware of not using with other drugs, never using drugs alone, and so on are really important. So harm reduction, and we get a lot of parents afraid about harm reduction because they think we're teaching teens to use. That's not what harm reduction is. Harm reduction is basically saying the best way to reduce teen use, the best way to reduce harm is not to use at all. But if you are going to, or your friends, let's keep you safe and let's keep you alive. And that's my other goal when we talk about drugs with teens.
No, absolutely. It's one of those things. So I was just at this high school, so there's a couple things are fresh on my mind. I always ask for questions. There's always an opportunity for them to ask questions. And one thing that they brought up was about nitrous oxide, galaxy gas, which we've seen going around a little bit more as well, which is, it's one of those areas where it's legit very dangerous. Like it's something where you use it the wrong way, like the compressed nitrous oxide, the temperature, you could really hurt or kill yourself, honestly, with that thing. And I think it's useful to talk about. We do have to talk about things like not using alone. We do need to talk about, fentanyl test strips and Narcan and avoiding overdoses. And like you're saying, at the same time, I think that there's going to be a lot of young people who hear this stuff and understand this is just, this is the reality of the environment. That's a deterrent. It's not like encouraging them to use or be like, oh, I'll be fine, as long as am able to be revived from the overdose. Like I don't think that's the mentality of a young person. Like as long as like I can use the fentanyl as long as someone's got some naloxone handy. Like I don't, I don't think that's the case. It's just, I think it only underscores the danger.
Absolutely. No, I completely agree. And certainly not the message is go ahead and use safely. It's still best is not to use at all. But if you are, let's cut down or be safe if you are. But I agree. We're not teaching them to use drugs safely. We're teaching them not to use at all. But at the same time, we want to arm them. And if their friends are using, even if they're not, if we can reach them to get them certain young people not to use. It's a hard balance. I'm a parent. My kids are older, 24 and 28, but I still remember when they were teenagers and young adults and talking to them about drugs and other health risk behaviors. And it's hard. It is not an easy conversation. And I feel for parents and educators today who are struggling with this. I feel for teens who are struggling with this. But all the more reason why we do need to come out from the perspective of understanding and really helping them understand what's going on.
Yeah. Well, and I'll use that to bridge to a slightly different topic, but one that you're very familiar with, which has to do with vaping, and where I think a lot of times young people aren't fully aware of what's going on, which I don't think is on accident. I remember reading an article recently. I don't think you published this one. I think this is somebody else, but that was talking about how there's certain even terminologies around vaping that are very consistent with lowering the perception of risk. Like even the word vaping sounds a lot more benign than aerosoling, which is probably a more accurate way of describing what you're doing. I think that young people oftentimes are misinformed, and that's a big part of what your curriculum does so well is letting them know what's actually going on there. From your perspective, I guess let's just start there. What role can we play in terms of getting between whatever narratives young people are getting from social media, from either direct advertising or indirect advertising, social media influencers? What are the important aspects that you want young people to know about vaping as a nicotine delivery system?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question, and I would say we try hard not even to say vaping. We say e-cigarettes or electronic cigarettes for exactly the reason that you're talking about. When we think that the term vaping came from the industry to really not have people think that electronic cigarettes are a form of cigarettes. They are a form of cigarettes. So I have been, it's funny, I taught about 250 teens in North Dakota to use our prevention materials as peer educators. And 2 days I got them saying, let's stop aerosolizing. And I thought, yes, this is great. That's what we need to be doing. And we do need and now, having said that, when I talk to teens, I certainly use the term vaping, but we need to try to use language to change the mindset to help them understand. And why? Because it is not harmless water vapor. It's not harmless flavors. Aerosols that are in there, not only the nicotine, the very, very high concentration in nicotine, up well over a pack of cigarettes worth of nicotine that's in these newer e-cigarettes, but you've got propylene glycol, glycerin, lead, formaldehyde. You've got all these different chemicals that are in there, and we need to help teens understand and what we do is we teach them by saying what's lead in batteries and things like that, because to just say lead to a teen, what does that mean? So we try to explain, do you want to put pesticides into your body? Well, you know what a pesticide is. Do you remember when you were in biology class and you dissected the frog? I always do this. How did it smell? Oh, it was awful. Well, yeah, it was awful because that's formaldehyde. That's something that you're inhaling into your body. And so really trying to help teens, not with not scare tactics, but help them understand what it is that they're putting into their bodies or into someone else. We talk about secondhand effects too. There is secondhand aerosol, secondhand smoke, because teens care about others and they care about the environment. So we do try to capitalize on all those different situations with young people. And then we talk about, teens say, oh, Dr. Bonnie, everybody calls me Dr. Bonnie. Dr. Bonnie, I'm just, vaping harmless water vapor or just flavors. Well, even if there's no nicotine or no THC in those e-cigarettes, which there probably is, and they may not realize it, but just the e-cigarette itself, that inhaling has propylene glycol, glycerin, vitamin E acetate, and flavors. And the flavorants have and other chemicals that have been shown in lots of studies to hurt your lungs. So, you're right. We need to talk about the health risks. We need to have them understand. And there's more and more research, even now connecting e-cigarettes with cancer that we're worried about as well. So a lot to learn, but there's a lot that we know already.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I know there's a study that I use a lot in my presentations that had some great graphs. It came out a couple years ago in a chemical toxicology journal, but where they used liquid chromatography, mass spectrometry to just by molecular weight, splatter out all the different compounds that are formed through the thermal degradation of the flavors of the propylene glycol of the vegetable glycerin. And sometimes just seeing that visual of like actually there are 1 to 2,000 chemicals that you're putting into your lungs when you do this. It has an effect. But it's something that really struck me, So there are these harms, and we can point to the science, we can point to the research. Something that stuck out to me as I was watching the Netflix documentary Big Vape, which is I think very interesting, very intriguing, kind of pulls the veil out from in front of what happened with Juul back when it first came out, was that there was a parent on there that described vaping as an exquisite prison because it tastes good. It's got a stronger nicotine hit even than cigarettes do, a lot more than earlier e-cigarettes. And you get trapped in there. And something that really struck me about that is the reason why that resonated so much was this idea of this original use case of cigarettes as being a harm reduction tool for people who were smoking. It was based on this idea, well, maybe we take the tar out of it, we cut the amount of chemical exposure down, maybe that helps with population health. But then no one ever asked the question, well, what then? Is this just like a parking lot where people will vape indefinitely? And if that's the case, what are the implications of that? And is this actually the most elegant solution? And so what I want to ask you the question of is from your perspective, and I say this from the standpoint of knowing we don't have a lot of direct data on it yet. How do people quit e-cigarettes? I'm going to try to avoid using the word vaping. Say aerosolizing and e-cigarettes today. But how do people quit that? And like, what do we know so far about how, is this just an exquisite prison where people go and never leave? Or what does the off-ramp look like?
It's a fantastic and very complicated question that we don't have great answers to. And it also depends on if you're talking about adults or teens. So, first of all, if I may, I'll answer the question, but I also just want to say when we're talking about teens and young adults, which is my specialty as well, it's not a matter of e-cigarettes versus cigarettes. In other words, it's not like teens are going and saying, or we're going and saying, I'm thinking about smoking a cigarette. No, I'll go the less harmful route and I'll choose an e-cigarette. And they're flavored and cool and stuff. Teens were not weighing e-cigarettes versus cigarettes. Teens were saying, and we know from papers we publish and others, teens don't want to use cigarettes, and they certainly didn't when e-cigarettes were becoming popular. So it wasn't, and I've often said, it's not e-cigarettes versus cigarettes, it's e-cigarettes versus air for young people. So when we're talking about teens who are addicted to e-cigarettes and trying to get off, it's a different situation, even though just as hard than adults. So for adults, could e-cigarettes and Juul have been the kind of holy grail to help adults quit smoking? Yes, could have. It was a very good product. And in full disclosure, I was one of the expert witnesses in a lot of the Juul cases, the Juul lawsuits against Juul. So, I just want to make that clear. But yes, adults who are using cigarettes, e-cigarettes, and Juul in particular, had a good formula that could have helped adults quit. what happened? Well, first of all, there was no step down for adults. So, to your question, it wasn't like, okay, use this e-cigarette that has 5%, then go to 3%, then go to 2% nicotine and one, and then go to zero. There was no off ramp offered for them. So you're right. A lot of adults went from cigarettes to e-cigarettes. And then much of the research is showing that most adults then, or not most, but a lot went back to cigarettes or were dual using. So now you're getting all of the nicotine and all of the chemicals that are both in cigarettes and in e-cigarettes, instead of recommending the patch and other things. Now we know it, and it takes what, 11 to 30 times to try to quit using cigarette to quit cigarettes. So e-cigarettes isn't much different. But the other problem when we're talking about teens with Juul and the more recent products is they weren't advertised as a cessation device. They weren't even authorized by the FDA to be used as a cessation device. And so they couldn't even say that, and any implications towards that was actually illegal to say. And instead, Juul and the more recent e-cigarettes, Puff Bar, which is now cannabis, but Puff Bar and Views and others, Elf Bar, are targeting our young people. They are advertising, they're marketing to young people. Flavors that we have out there, you and I as adults don't want sugary, sweet, cherry flavors and stuff. That's not our flavors. That's kids. So for teens, quitting is very difficult. We've seen so many teens who are struggling to quit e-cigarettes. So I like that parent's analogy. It is being incarcerated, it is being in jail. It's like having that cell around you. Why? Part of it has to do with the nicotine, as you mentioned, the nicotine amount and the kind, the salt-based nicotine that's smooth, easy to use. You don't have that throat hit that cigarettes and older e-cigarettes had. It's very satisfying and it's very absorbent and easy to become addicted. And the high concentrations. We also don't have good ways to help adults quit. There are currently no nicotine replacement therapies by the FDA for anybody under 18. Now, we do have healthcare providers recommending and prescribing in some states and some areas, but we just don't have that. I know you work in the area of treatment. We don't, we have cognitive behavioral therapy, we have motivational interviewing, we have other techniques, but so many teens are struggling. We have great, this is quitting and X and My Life, My Quit. We have our Healthy Futures, alternative to suspension, cessation curriculums, but not a lot is sticking with young people. And I think it's the physiological aspect of that nicotine grip. And I think it's the social. It is still everywhere around us right now. We are seeing e-cigarettes everywhere. And so that's been the other difficulty. It's ubiquitous.
Right. Well, it makes it so challenging too, right? You've got that social facilitation or social proof where you can turn outwards and see it. I also think, part of what's so challenging about this, right? And it's tough because I definitely understand the idea of maybe you would have an adult if it was cigarettes versus e-cigarettes. Maybe they'd be better off, but I like that comparison of for kids it's more like air versus aerosols you're looking at. That people can go to sleep with these things, and they have like 20,000, 25,000, even 50,000 sometimes. So much nicotine is packed into this. There's a study I know that really caught my eye, came out maybe like 6-7 months ago now, that was looking at the trends of vapes over time, and what they found was that the potency went up by 70%, the capacity went up by about 5 times as much on average, and the cost per milliliter of nicotine went down by 30%. So what we're getting are these devices, right? And I don't know about all the history of cigarettes, but my assumption is that probably we didn't see that same sort of trend where over 5 years they just got huge, and they stayed, tobacco was always tobacco. That we're seeing these innovations, if you will, and these escalations in terms of the potential addictive potency, the capacity, that I feel like just makes it even tougher for someone to say, I don't want to do this anymore, when they're just constantly getting draws off it, where for cigarettes at least you had to go outside.
100% agree. And with cigarettes, not only do you have to go outside, and in the last, what, 15 years or so, since we've had our clean indoor air laws, 20 years, whatever it's been, but you also know when you're done with a cigarette. So it makes calculating, we used to talk about pack years, right? Or packs per day or packs per week. We don't really have an equivalent with e-cigarettes. So we don't even know as scientists how to measure use. And when I've asked teens, well, how much are you using? A pot a day, a pot a week, elf bar a day, which is what, 4,000 plus puffs. It's just an enormous amount of nicotine and chemicals that's really difficult to detect. They smell good. If I've often taught parents when I teach them or to give talks to them, if your kids or if your kid's room smells like strawberries, bananas, mangoes, blueberries, it's probably not fruit salad. It's probably something that they're using, whether it's nicotine or cannabis with flavors in them. So it's really difficult to detect. It's really difficult to measure. You're right. Teens are using this under their pillow all night. I wake up in the middle of the night, check my phone because I check email constantly or worrying about the world. Teens wake up in the middle of the night and also worrying about the world, and they're taking a hit. And so it's so hard. And I've often said we're playing whack-a-mole. The FDA in January of 2020 prioritized enforcement against pod-based e-cigarettes, basically Juul. And then, but they really didn't touch the other products, the new disposables. So of course, those became on the market in just nonstop fashion. And pretty much every e-cigarette that is on the market right now is illegal. They've not been authorized by the FDA to be sold and marketed in the United States. And yet we're playing whack-a-mole. We're dealing with one product at a time, and then you get new e-cigarettes that have Game Boys in there and video games. And somebody told me about a Tamagotchi version that if you don't keep vaping, it dies. Well, I mean, you and I know that's affecting our teens and our young adults, and highlighters that are real highlighters that are also vapes, and it's just endless right now. We have a lot of work to do to prevent, and then we're getting so many teens addicted, as we said, that is just incredibly concerning. And that's nicotine. Then you add THC to the e-cigarettes, and a lot of teens are co-using to get the extra high, the chasing, the boost that they get from the addiction, and they don't understand it as the other issue.
Yeah. Well, so you mentioned a bit about like regulatory whack-a-mole, and I did want to ask you about this because I think you've got a great vantage point on just what's going on globally speaking, or in terms of the public health arena. I've noticed this as well, that it really does seem like first they were going at, I remember actually for a minute there, way back in the beginning, a few years back with vaping, where the FDA gave a cease and desist to Puff Bar, and when they were big, and then they were off the market. Like they shut their website down for like 3 months, and then they came back, and they were I think the first ones really who made tobacco-free nicotine big, because at that point in time the FDA could just regulate tobacco. They couldn't regulate nicotine. And it's just constantly this thing where there's this either, and then there's Elf Bar, right? Elf Bar gets cease and desist. They literally just changed the name, and now they're back with BC 5000. And so what I'm wondering about is from your perspective, like, is there actually a way to go on offense in these areas where it's not just like we're constantly playing defense? What are they doing now? How do we react to it? It feels like there's always this push-pull between profits and industry and business around the addiction for profit industries, if you will, and then public health, where there's some of us being like, wait a second, we really need to take a more comprehensive approach to just protect public health in general, certainly public health of teens. Like maybe we should be not allowing for Tamagotchis to be put inside vapes to begin with, because that is a real thing. You can go out and buy right now. Like it's like so darkly cynical that you have to poison yourself to not kill your virtual pet. But that's where we are. And what I'm wondering about is like, how do we actually push into this area rather than have to be reactive to the businesses that are just making as much money as they can before they're shut down? Like, what needs to happen?
It's a multi-million-dollar question. It's a fabulous question. And I went when I published some of the earlier papers showing the transition, from the January 20th authorizing, or excuse me, prioritizing against Juul and other pod-based and moving over to disposables. And we published one of the early papers that say, that didn't work. Everybody's just switched over, and basically proposing and talking about whack-a-mole and proposing that the FDA really just needs to do a regulation of the entire class of e-cigarettes. And so what does regulation mean there? I mean, right now they are regulating it in the sense that any e-cigarette that's on the market has to go through the pre-market tobacco application process, PMTA process. Well, they did. The e-cigarette companies did. And then what happens after that is, even if they got denied, they're still on the market. Or in the case of Juul and some of the other companies, they got denied authorization for selling, and they just sued back and pushed back. And so then the FDA has to say, okay, you can continue selling until we figure this lawsuit out. And so it's my dream would be that we just regulate them all as a class of products, all tobacco products. But then again, what does regulation mean? Do we disallow every one of them, or do we say for freedom of speech and freedom of marketing in the US, okay, well, you can have them, but they should be behind the firewall of a pharmacy and only be used for those who are smoking cigarettes and helping them quit. I think the problem is, and I don't mean to sound cynical, and this is a new cynicism I have. I think a couple years ago I felt like we should just ban them all or put them behind the firewall of the pharmacy. And the reason why I'm more cynical about that is, even if we did that, we still have illegal products on the market. So now we're at the point of, we've got the legal and the illegal market. And what do you do with the illegal market? And I mean illegal both in the US, manufacturers who just, like you're saying, move from one name like Elf Bar to the BZ 5000, and then you've got e-cigarettes coming across the borders, and we've got regulation areas there. So I am very much in favor of reducing risk through policies, but this one's evading me. I don't know what to do on this one to really stop the problem, because of the fact that it's so easy to escape. So what do I really think we need? I also think we need enforcement. Even in California, we have the flavor ban, which I helped testify for and help get that passed. It was hugely important, big win in California. We have Senate Bill 793, which then went to the voters as Prop 31, to get all tobacco, with a couple of exceptions, but basically all tobacco flavored tobacco products off the market. Teens are still getting them. Through the internet, through illegal sales, products being imported, and so on. And part of it is enforcement. We just need parents. We need everybody listening to this podcast. We need teachers, teens, healthcare providers, law enforcement to really enforce the laws, because the laws can only go so far. And same thing with Tobacco 21. We just published a study showing about 40% of people across the country don't realize that the law now is 21, in which you can be sold tobacco. Well, that's just lack of knowledge that we need to teach people, and then we need to say, and now you have to enforce the Tobacco 21, because the federal government can't do it all. We have to rely on local and state enforcement as well. So sorry, that was a very long answer, but it's so complicated.
Yeah. Well, and I think so. I have a couple thoughts about this. I actually, so my last episode of the podcast, I talked to Dr. Matt Rosheim, and he does a lot of work on semi-synthetics, or he calls them hemp-derived psychoactive. I got to remember his acronym, but Delta 8, etc. And he was talking about how even when you've got anything short of a ban, but even if there are bans in states, still about 45% of vape shops will sell these products. Or, if you look at online vendors, there's another study I saw, 90% of online vendors will ship a Delta 8 product to your house, even if you're in a state where that is not lawful. And so I think that there is this question of, like, how can we, or why are we not enforcing this, when I could literally, like, walk into like a gas station or a vape shop and see all of these illegal vape products all over the wall. I think that there's a big issue there in terms of why aren't we enforcing the law? But I think ultimately what that says to me, whether or not we're talking about like either like straight up like black market drug dealer sort of stuff or vape shops selling things that are technically illegal, but no one seems to be enforcing it right now, or things that are legal, I think access. We've seen plenty of information, that the data that shows that access drives use rates. When something is accessible, when it's in front of a young person, they're more likely to use it. But I think it comes back then though to what the work that we do so much of, which is education. Because you can't fully remove it. I don't think you should just open the floodgates and just let, these for-profit entities sell everything. At the same time, though, it's going to be there. And whether or not kids have that frame of saying like, ooh, like maybe I shouldn't put this unregulated product, which could have God knows what inside of it, and then decompose into, whatever else. Maybe I should be thoughtful about if I want to expose my lungs and body and brain to this. I think that ultimately is the final, most important battleground, is the choices that young people make.
100% agree. And it's interesting because, like I said, and we were able to really curb cigarette use largely through policies, right? I mean, as much as I hope some of the education I was doing was helpful, I think
Sure.
cigarettes really were regulated. We did a good job. We did smoke-free laws and things like that. E-cigarettes just evade so much of the policy, and we still do the policy. I think we have to, and I agree with the regulation of it and the enforcement. But I totally agree. We need education. But we need education not just to young people. We need education for parents, for healthcare providers. And we still have healthcare providers who say for adults, go ahead and use an e-cigarette to quit. Well, what is that telling young people when they see their parents using e-cigarettes? Or it's okay to smoke that cannabis, it's now legal. Yeah, but what that's telling to young people. So education needs to be first and foremost, but needs to be well beyond just teenagers.
But final question on vaping, and then I want to pivot to a different topic. I'm sorry, not vaping, aerosolizing. E-cigarettes.
I'm going to get you to change.
If someone wants to quit, I know, no. This is like I'm having flashbacks to like when we all made the switch away towards person first language, and we phased like alcoholic and addict out of our lexicon. Like I got to do this with vaping. I got to do this with vaping. But if a young person wants to stop, or if a parent is listening to this podcast and wants to know what can I do, you referenced earlier that nicotine replacement options, although I know the American Academy of Pediatrics has recommended that some pediatricians consider it, it's not FDA approved. I feel like our tools are more limited in general in terms of what we can use. What would be your best recommendation of resources, tools, places for people to look if they're trying to stop using e-cigarettes?
Yeah, well, and I still would turn to NRTs, nicotine replacement therapies, if you're in a state and a group that allows that. You do have to go to a physician or a healthcare provider for it if you're under 18. But given the large amounts of nicotine, sometimes teens can't quit without some help there. But otherwise, I do think therapy, kind of behavioral therapy. I think that this is quitting, which I think is becoming well, through the Truth Initiative, is just had a wonderful study published in JAMA showing the effects, positive effects of this is quitting. I think some of the other state coaching programs can be helpful. I think reaching out to your school counselors, and if your school doesn't have counselors, go to the Department of Public Health, because they often do have some resources for you, whether it's our alternative to suspension cessation programs or other coaching programs or counseling programs in schools. And some of it depends on insurance if you can go do private counseling. But and then I would say to parents, if you're listening and you find that your son, daughter, child is using, it's not to punish. It's not the time to punish them. It's not the time to yell at them. Let's get teens help. And I think we have to change the mindset. We've been talking a lot on this podcast about marketing and about how manipulative, without using the word yet on this, but basically manipulative the industry has been in targeting young people. And it took us in tobacco control and in healthcare, a few years to catch up to the industry. So why are we blaming teens? Let's help them. So I'd say be supportive Realize it might take multiple times till your teenager stops using. You might have to do multiple methods, but don't give up. It is hard, but we're there for you, and just know that there are resources. It's just not going to be as easy as what we might find. But even cigarettes, despite all the resources that are available, it still takes multiple times to quit cigarettes.
So it sounds like there are professional resources. There might be some medical, like some pharmacological, NRT resources, but mostly just recognize that it's going to be a while. It's going to take some time. And I think something else that you said that I think is a great bridge to the next topic that I wanted to talk about is that this isn't necessarily something that we just punish our way out of. And something that I preach a lot when I talk to young people is that there is always a why behind almost all human behavior. Like there's always a purpose behind it, and oftentimes an emotional one. And so if you see someone acting in a way that seems like it's counter to their interests in some way, like to their health, or it's causing problems with their parents or at school, but they keep doing it, getting something from that that's really powerful to them. And usually the most powerful forces that act on us are the ones that cut to our heart and to our feelings. And what this reminded me of, there was actually just a couple of days ago, there was an article published in Pediatrics. It was an analysis on the monitoring the future data out of Michigan. And what they found was that when you ask teens the most common reason why they use e-cigarettes, the top reason was to cope with stress and to relax, to deal with the stressors that they're facing. And that reminded me of another study that I saw that said the same thing about THC. When you asked kids who are having cannabis use disorders, who qualify for that, why they do it, that was about coping with stress or escapism. We see the same thing with problematic internet gaming disorder is the terminology that's being used right now for folks who are using. It's all about how do we deal with the mental health concerns that we're facing.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering from your perspective and your vantage point, where is that overlap between mental health and substance use or addictive behaviors more generally? And where do you see the imperative being, like, or is there an imperative to really go hard at youth mental health right now? Everything we've been talking about today might be downstream of that.
I 100% agree. It, and I do think a lot of what we're seeing is downstream. And I think when we talk about upstream, one of the things we really needed to do is mental health issues. You're absolutely right. We've published papers as well. Many have, showing that not only is it a reason why teens are using, but that teens who are using are more likely to be depressed, more likely to be anxious and have stress. So it's and teens, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the national data set there, showing that teens are more stressed out now than ever before in the last few years. Pandemic, U.S. social issues across the globe, and so on. So helping teens understand, and we do this in our curriculums, helping them find other ways to cope with their stress rather than drugs. And a lot of teens say, oh, it helped me. But really what it's doing is making you feel less bad. And what I mean by that is not the drugs. It's that once you're addicted, if you stop using, you then go through withdrawal and you feel really bad, really awful physically as well as mentally. So they think that taking the hit, using drugs, is helping them feel better, but it's really helping them feel less bad, less sick. And so we have to help teens understand that, and have to help them understand that using drugs is not the way to cope. And we understand that you're stressed out. We understand, and we want to help you. We have information on our curriculums on breathing techniques, mental health coping techniques, talking to friends, figuring out what makes you happy. Drugs don't provide happiness. They provide a false sense of pleasure in your brain, but it's not true happiness. And understanding the difference takes some time and some work for some people, but we need to work with teens to understand the difference. And this is where families and schools can come in. And sometimes teens may need counseling that is not just drug counseling, but for mental health. And the other thing is we need to stop stigmatizing mental health issues. We need to stop stigmatizing drug use. You were talking about the person-centered language change. That's because we were stigmatizing, to say you're addictive as opposed to a person with substance use disorder. We need to not label people, and we're doing that in a lot of things right now in this world, and we just need to stop because teens are hearing that. and not to be afraid to reach out and say, I'm struggling. I need some help. And to also realize that struggling is normal, it's part of life. Life is tough. So let's support each other, give teens a big hug across the US, across the globe, and try to figure out ways to help them instead of blaming and shaming. I think we're going to go a long way in helping young people.
Sure. And I think something that's occurred to me recently is that it really is that so businesses are all about solving problems, right? Like the whole idea of a business model is like, let's find a problem that a lot of people have and give them a solution to it, and then people will buy it. And I think that's what, whether or not we're talking about social media companies, whether or not we're talking about gambling or THC or nicotine, it's all saying like, what's the emotional problem that people are having? And there are a lot of emotional problems out there right now. And let's give them this feels like a solution in the moment to it, but then, chemically or behaviorally traps them. I think that that ultimately is where right now we're falling short, where we're not like, I love that you include breathing exercises. That, by the way, is also my go-to. I think that breath work, some mindfulness grounding techniques are some of the easiest ways you can actually like change your physiology around stress in like 2 minutes. If you teach someone how to do diaphragmatic breathing properly, like it's quick in terms of someone feeling like a noticeable sense of relief in that moment. We've got to start teaching that. We've got to give people a better option. I think we're just going to keep coming up short, and it's going to be Galaxy Gas, or it's going to be the next company that's producing e-cigarettes, or it's going to be a different semi-synthetic.
100% agree. Yeah. Yeah.
So we finish up here today. We've got just a couple more minutes to go. I want to think again about how where we can take this and move forward, because I do think that like prevention, almost by its name, is about like it's like in reaction to something else. It's like saying like we want to prevent someone else from doing something, which generally has to do with pushing substances or young people from using substances. If you had, because I think a lot of folks who listen to this podcast are in the world either of prevention or public health or treatment. It's more about definitely helpers and people who want to do something. If you had to give us a call to action here at the end of the day, what we can do in your mind that's a lower hanging fruit, whether or not it's in our own healthcare systems, or if it is in our state houses, or if it has to do more with policy change, like what are your top level items where you think, man, if only this was happening more, it could really make a big difference in whether or not it's like mental health leading to substance use or the substance use trends in youth right now? What would it be?
Yeah. About three or four, but I'll say them quickly. I think getting a handle on the mental health issue
Yeah,
is,
yeah, let's do it.
yeah, I think getting a handle on their mental health issues is first and foremost, absolutely, as we discussed. A couple other things that we need, one is getting rid of flavors of whether it's e-cigarette flavors or THC flavors. Uh, is really important because teens are using, or they're starting to use, in large part because of the flavors. And teens say if there aren't flavors, I don't want to use them. So that would help. The other is we have no standard, meaning top maximum for THC or nicotine levels. We've been talking about the huge amount of nicotine that's in these e-cigarettes. It is well above what you need to become addicted, and certainly well above what the brains need. There's no top amount. There is in other countries, 1.7%, I think it is in the UK. Same thing with THC. We have 20% THC. It was 3 to 5% when we were kids. And then when you're looking at dabbing, for example, which is not e-cigarettes, but inhaling, 80% THC. So another call to action would be lowering the standards so we're not having endless amount. And then the third or fourth, wherever we're at, is the regulation and enforcement. I think that's important for us to be able to do. And then finally, talk. If you're listening to this podcast, I always tell parents and teachers, don't schedule, okay, on Saturday at, 3:00, my kid and I are going to sit down and have a conversation. No, it doesn't work. My kids would say I was the queen of like coming up with times to talk about things. Say, Johnny, I just listened to a podcast and this is what I learned. Can we learn together? Let's go to our Reach Lab websites, other websites, your websites, information, and learn together because we need to be talking about these issues, mental health, substance use, the combination, rather than hiding from it. So that would be my final call to action. Talk. Just talk.
That is a wonderful, wonderful place to leave it. And Dr. Bonnie, as it sounds like you get told the most, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show today. I really appreciate it. This has been so insightful. You've got such a great perspective on this and such a broad perspective on this. I know I got a ton from the conversation, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. And thanks for doing all the good work you're doing out there as well. It takes a village in this case.